Eleanor Whitmore had barely set down her travel case when the Duke of Ravensford gave her an order that made her stomach turn cold. Smile and say nothing. He said it without raising his voice, without even looking at her directly. He stood by the tall window of his study, his back straight, his hands folded behind him, as though the words cost him nothing at all. Eleanor stood near the door, her damp cloak still clinging to her shoulders from the carriage ride through the rain, and she waited for him to explain himself. He did not. "I do not understand, Your Grace," she said carefully. "You do not need to understand," he replied. "You need only obey. Whatever you see in this house, whatever you hear, you will smile, and you will say nothing. That is the condition of your employment here. Break it, and you will be gone before nightfall." Eleanor had traveled 3 days to reach Ashcombe Hall, recommended for the position of governess by a respected family in London, who had nothing but praise for her patience and her intelligence. She had expected long hours with a young pupil, perhaps a distant employer too busy with estate matters to trouble himself with her comings and goings. She had not expected to be handed a warning before she had even removed her gloves. "May I ask why such a condition is necessary?" she said. The Duke turned from the window then, and for the first time she saw his face fully in the candlelight. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair combed back from a face that might have been called handsome if it were not so guarded. His eyes were the kind that gave nothing away, the kind that had learned long ago how to hide whatever moved behind them. "You may ask," he said, "but I will not answer. Do we have an understanding, Miss Whitmore?" She thought of her empty purse, of the letter from her late father's creditors still folded in her case, of the fact that she had nowhere else to go if she refused this post. She thought, too, of her own stubborn curiosity, which had gotten her into trouble more than once in her 24 years. "We have an understanding, Your Grace," she said. He studied her for a moment longer, as though weighing whether she meant it, then gave a short nod and gestured toward the door. "Mrs. Bell will show you to your room. You will begin with Grace tomorrow morning." Grace, she would learn, was his young ward, an orphaned girl of 8 years who had lived at Ashcombe Hall since her parents had died 2 winters past. Eleanor followed the housekeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently pressed into a thin, careful line, through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The candles burned low, throwing long shadows across the floor, and the whole house seemed to hold its breath around her. "You mustn't mind him," Mrs. Bell said quietly as they climbed the stairs. The Duke was not always so cold. Grief changes a man. "Grief for whom?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Bell's mouth pressed tighter still, and she said nothing more until they reached the small, comfortable room that would be Eleanor's own. "Sleep well, Miss Whitmore. Morning comes early at Ashcombe Hall." Eleanor lay awake long after the housekeeper's footsteps faded down the corridor. The rain had stopped, but the wind still pressed against the windows, and somewhere below her, she thought she heard the low murmur of voices. She told herself it was nothing, that great houses always made strange sounds at night, and she closed her eyes and tried to sleep. But sleep would not come. Her mind kept turning over the Duke's strange order, the way his jaw had tightened when he spoke it, the way Mrs. Bell had gone quiet at the mention of grief. There was a story here, she was certain of it, though she had promised herself she would not go looking for it. She had come to Ashcombe Hall for honest work, not for secrets. And yet, past midnight, when her stomach growled and she remembered she had eaten nothing since noon, she found herself slipping out of bed and into the dark corridor in search of the kitchen, or failing that, a book to distract her restless mind. The house at night was a different creature entirely from the house by day. Every board seemed to creak beneath her slippered feet. Every shadow seemed to shift when she was not looking directly at it. She found herself, quite by accident, in a room she had not been shown, a study smaller than the one where the Duke had greeted her, tucked away behind a narrow door that had been left slightly ajar. A single candle still burned on the desk within, its flame guttering low, as though someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to extinguish it. Eleanor knew she should turn back. Every instinct told her this was not a room meant for her eyes. But the candlelight fell across a drawer that had been pulled open, its lock broken, its contents spilling loose across the desk like a hand of cards someone had dropped in haste. And there, on top of the scattered papers, lay a set of deeds, their wax seals cracked, their old ink faded but still legible. She should not have looked. She told herself so even as her eyes moved across the page, even as her feet carried her closer without her permission. The deed bore the name of the estate, Ashcombe Hall, and beneath it, a name she did not expect to see at all, a name that had no business appearing on a document meant to establish the current Duke's claim to the land, and the title that came with it. The name was not Ravensford. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, certain her tired eyes were playing tricks on her in the dim light, but the ink held firm. The deed named another man entirely as the rightful heir, a name she did not recognize, dated some 15 years past, and beneath it, a second document, newer, bearing the current Duke's father's signature, transferring the claim through means she could not fully make out in the candlelight. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. She had no time to think, only to act, and she blew out the candle and pressed herself into the shadow of a tall bookcase, just as the door swung open wider, and a figure stepped into the room. She recognized the silhouette at once, tall and straight-backed, and she held her breath as the Duke of Ravensford crossed to the desk in the darkness, his movements quick and sure, as though he knew every inch of the room by memory alone. He gathered the papers with hands that were not quite steady, cursing softly under his breath at the broken lock, and Eleanor watched from the shadows as he pressed the deeds back into the drawer and forced it shut. He stood there a long moment afterward, his shoulders bowed in a way she had not seen in the study downstairs, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe Hall, he did not look like a man in command of everything around him. He looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for one pair of shoulders. Then he straightened, drew in a breath, and left the room as quickly as he had entered it. Eleanor did not move for a long while after his footsteps faded. Her mind raced through everything she had seen, the strange name on the deed, the transfer of claim, the Duke's own hands trembling as he hid the evidence away. She thought of his order from earlier that evening, the demand that she smile and say nothing, and a cold understanding began to settle over her. He had not been speaking of ordinary household matters. He had been speaking of this. She made her way back to her room in the darkness, moving carefully past every creaking board, and when she finally reached her bed, she lay staring up at the ceiling, her mind far too awake for sleep. She thought of the small girl she was meant to teach in the morning, an orphan who called this house her home, who trusted the Duke to protect her and provide for her. She thought of what it might mean if the deed she had glimpsed was true, if the title and the land and everything that came with it belonged, by law, to someone else entirely. And she thought of her promise, given not an hour before, to smile and say nothing. She had meant it as a simple agreement to keep her post. She had not known, when she gave her word, precisely what it was she would be asked to keep silent about. Now she understood, with a clarity that chilled her more than the night air ever could, that she had walked into Ashcombe Hall carrying a secret far larger than any she had ever held before, and that the man who had sworn her to silence did not yet know how much she had already seen. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, her first day teaching young Grace her letters and her numbers, as though nothing at all had changed. But something had changed, deep beneath the surface of the house, and Eleanor Whitmore knew, as she finally closed her eyes, that she would never again look at the Duke of Ravensford the same way she had looked at him only hours before. She did not sleep easily. Every sound in the old house seemed sharper now, every shadow seemed to hold a secret of its own, and somewhere below her, in a locked drawer behind a broken lock, lay proof of a truth that could unmake everything the Duke of Ravensford had built his life upon. When the first gray light of morning finally crept through her window, Eleanor rose feeling as though she had not slept at all. She washed her face in the basin left for her, dressed in her plainest gown, and tried to arrange her features into something calm before she left her room. She reminded herself, with every step down the stairs, that she was a governess now, nothing more, and that whatever she had seen in the night belonged to a world far above her station. She found young Grace waiting in the small schoolroom at the back of the house, a thin girl with solemn eyes far older than her 8 years. Grace sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the door as though she had learned, somewhere along the way, not to expect kindness too quickly. "Good morning," Eleanor said gently. "I am Miss Whitmore. I understand we shall be spending our mornings together." Grace studied her for a long moment before answering. "Are you going to leave, like the others?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. The others? The last governess left after 2 weeks, and the one before her, after 3 days. Grace's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, as though she were reporting the weather rather than the quiet tragedy of being repeatedly abandoned. "My uncle frightens people." Eleanor knelt so that she was level with the girl's eyes. "I do not frighten easily," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it. A small, cautious smile touched Grace's mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Eleanor caught it, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. Whatever secrets this house held, whatever danger lay folded inside that broken drawer, this child deserved someone who would not vanish at the first sign of trouble. The lessons that morning passed more easily than Eleanor had expected. Grace was clever, quicker with her letters than most children her age, and she answered questions about her favorite stories with a spark of life that made Eleanor forget, for whole minutes at a time, the deed she had seen in the candlelight. But the memory returned each time the schoolroom door creaked open, each time she heard footsteps in the corridor beyond, and by midday she could not stop herself from glancing toward the wing of the house where the small study lay hidden. At luncheon, taken quietly in a corner of the servants' dining room rather than with the family, Eleanor tried to draw Mrs. Bell into conversation, without seeming to pry. "Has the Duke always managed the estate alone?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "It seems a great deal for one man." Mrs. Bell's spoon paused over her bowl. "His father managed it before him, and managed it poorly, if you want the truth of it, though I'll deny I said so. The old Duke left behind more trouble than treasure when he passed. His Grace has spent every year since trying to set it right." "Set what right?" Mrs. Bell's eyes flicked toward the door, and her voice dropped lower. "That is not mine to say, Miss Whitmore, and I would advise you, kindly, not to ask it of anyone else in this house either. Some doors are better left closed." Eleanor thought of the door she had already opened, quite by accident, and said nothing further. But the housekeeper's warning only confirmed what she already suspected, that the papers hidden in that broken drawer were no small matter, and that more than one person beneath this roof knew far more than they were willing to say aloud. 3 days passed before Eleanor found another chance to slip back into the small study, and when she did, her hands trembled as she reached for the drawer. It was locked again, properly this time. A new clasp fitted where the old one had been broken. She stood before it in the gray light of early afternoon, Grace occupied with her needlework under Mrs. Bell's watchful eye, and felt a flicker of frustration mixed with something close to relief. Perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps whatever secret lay behind that lock was not hers to uncover. But the thought did not sit easily with her, and over the following days, Eleanor found herself noticing things she might otherwise have overlooked. The solicitor who came to Ashcombe Hall twice that week, always after dark, always shone in through the side entrance rather than the main door. The way the Duke's face changed when his steward mentioned a name she did not recognize, a Mr. Edmund Cole, spoken once in passing and never again. The way certain rooms in the East Wing remained locked at all hours, their keys kept on a ring the housekeeper wore close against her waist. She said nothing of what she had seen. She kept her promise, smiling politely at supper when the Duke asked after Grace's progress, offering no hint that her mind was occupied with anything beyond her lessons. But her silence was not the empty silence he had asked for. It was watchful, deliberate, and every day it grew heavier with things she had not been meant to know. She began to keep a private accounting in her mind, though she never dared write a word of it on paper. The solicitor's visits fell on Mondays and Thursdays, always after the household had taken its evening meal, always concluded before the church bell in the village struck 10. The locked rooms in the East Wing numbered 3, by her count, though she could not guess what they held. And the steward, a quiet man named Mr. Pratt who rarely spoke more than was necessary, seemed to carry a folder of papers with him whenever he crossed paths with the Duke. Papers he guarded as closely as if they were made of gold rather than parchment. Eleanor told herself, again and again, that none of this was her concern. She had a position to keep, wages to earn, a girl to teach. She had promised silence, and silence she intended to keep, whatever storm might be gathering beneath the surface of Ashcombe Hall. But promises made in the safety of daylight had a way of growing harder to keep once the candles were lit, and the whole house seemed to hum with things unspoken. One evening, as she carried a stack of Grace's finished lessons down to the study to leave for the Duke's review, she came upon Mrs. Bell standing very still in the corridor outside the locked East Wing, a ring of keys clutched tightly in one hand, her face pale in the lamplight. "Mrs. Bell," Eleanor said softly, "are you unwell?" The housekeeper startled, then pressed a hand to her chest and managed a thin smile. "Only tired, Miss Whitmore. This house asks a great deal of an old woman's nerves, some nights more than others. Is there anything I might do to help?" "Help?" Mrs. Bell's laugh held no humor at all. "You might help by keeping to your lessons in your rooms, child, and leaving the rest of this house to those who understand it. I do not say that unkindly. I say it because I have watched governesses come and go from this place, and the ones who lasted longest were the ones who learned not to look too closely at what did not concern them." Eleanor thought of the deed, of Mr. Cole's smooth threat, of Grace's innocent report of a mistake that could take everything away, and wondered whether Mrs. Bell knew the full shape of the secret or only its shadow. She did not ask. She only nodded, wished the housekeeper a good night, and continued down the corridor with the papers still clutched against her chest, her mind turning faster than her feet. It was Grace, in her own innocent way, who gave Eleanor the next piece of the puzzle. "My uncle wasn't always the Duke," the girl said one afternoon, without looking up from the book of pressed flowers she was arranging on the schoolroom table. "Before, we lived in a smaller house. Papa used to visit us there." Eleanor kept her voice carefully even. "Your uncle became Duke when his own father passed, did he not?" "That's what he tells people." Grace pressed a violet flat between two pages, her small fingers deft and careful. "But sometimes I hear him talking to Mr. Farrow, the solicitor. He says things about a mistake his father made. A mistake that could take everything away." Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she kept her hands steady as she helped Grace arrange the next flower. "You should not listen at doors, Grace. It is not polite." "I don't mean to listen," Grace said solemnly. "The walls in this house are very thin, and my uncle's voice gets loud when he is frightened, even though he tries to sound like he isn't." Frightened. Eleanor turned the word over in her mind long after the lesson ended, long after Grace had been put to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. She had not thought to imagine the Duke as a frightened man. He carried himself with such control, such cold command, that fear seemed the last thing that could touch him. And yet Grace's simple observation matched what Eleanor herself had witnessed in the study that first night, the way his shoulders had bowed the moment he believed himself unwatched. She thought of the deed again, the unfamiliar name beneath the estates, the transfer signed in his father's hand. If the old Duke had done something dishonest to secure the title, something that could be undone if the truth came to light, then the current Duke was not simply guarding a family secret. He was guarding his entire life, the roof over Grace's head, the position that gave him power to protect the girl he had taken in. It did not excuse the demand he had made of her, but it began, slowly, to explain it. The following week brought a change to the household that Eleanor could not ignore. A carriage arrived unannounced on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and from it stepped a man Eleanor had never seen before. Tall and narrow-faced, dressed well but not richly, with the look of someone accustomed to being underestimated and resenting it deeply. He introduced himself to the staff as Mr. Edmund Cole, and the moment his name was spoken aloud, Eleanor understood exactly who he must be. The name from the deed, the name that did not belong to the Ravensford line. The Duke received him in the main study. The door closed firmly behind them, and Eleanor, passing through the corridor on some invented errand, could not help but slow her steps as raised voices carried faintly through the heavy wood. "You have no claim that would stand in any court," she heard the Duke say, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Perhaps not," came the reply, smooth and unhurried, "but a court is not the only place a claim might be heard, Your Grace. Society has its own ways of ruining a man, and they require no judge at all." Eleanor forced herself to keep walking before anyone noticed her lingering, but her mind raced with everything she had just heard confirmed. Mr. Cole was not here to settle the matter quietly. He was here to threaten, and the threat he carried was aimed squarely at the Duke's good name, at the title that gave Grace her home and her place in the world. That evening, the Duke summoned Eleanor to his study for the first time since the night of her arrival. She entered with her heart beating hard against her ribs, certain, in some foolish corner of her mind, that he had somehow discovered what she knew. But his purpose was simpler and stranger than she expected. "Grace will require extra lessons in deportment," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "There is a possibility we will be entertaining visitors of consequence in the coming weeks, and I would have her prepared." "Of course, Your Grace." Eleanor hesitated, then added, more boldly than she intended, "May I ask if something troubles you? You seem burdened these past days." His eyes lifted to hers then, sharp and searching, as though trying to determine how much truth lay behind the question. For a moment, she thought he might answer honestly. His jaw worked, his hand tightened against the edge of his desk, and something almost vulnerable passed across his face, before the familiar coldness settled back into place. "You were hired to teach my ward, Miss Whitmore, not to concern yourself with matters beyond your position," he said, though there was less bite in the words than there might have been a week before. "Good night." Eleanor left the study with her cheeks warm, unsure whether she felt more embarrassed by his rebuke or more certain than ever that beneath his cold command lay a man fighting a battle he could not win alone. She thought of Mr. Cole's smooth, unhurried threat, of the deed hidden behind its new lock, of Grace's innocent report of a mistake that could take everything away. She had promised to smile and say nothing. She had not promised to stop watching, to stop understanding, to stop caring, against every instinct of good sense, What became of the man who had given her that strange and desperate order on her very first night at Ashcombe Hall? Later, lying awake as the wind pressed once more against her window, Eleanor found herself wondering not whether the secret would come out, but when, and what it would cost everyone in this house when it finally did. She thought of Grace's quiet trust, of the Duke's carefully guarded eyes, and she understood, with a certainty that unsettled her deeply, that she was no longer merely a governess who had stumbled upon a secret by accident. The next morning, she rose early and walked the gardens before Grace's lessons began, hoping the cold air might clear her head. The gardens at Ashcombe Hall had been left to grow wild in places, hedges untrimmed, roses climbing without direction along the old stone walls, and Eleanor found a strange comfort in their disorder. It seemed, in its own way, an honest reflection of the house itself, beautiful and neglected, and hiding more than it showed. She was not entirely surprised, rounding a corner of the hedge, to find the Duke there before her, standing motionless beside a fountain long since gone dry, his coat collar turned up against the morning chill. He did not hear her approach at first, and for a moment she watched him unnoticed, struck by how different he looked when he believed himself alone. The coldness that armored him at supper, in the study, in every exchange with his staff, had fallen away entirely. What remained was simply a tired man staring into an empty fountain as though it might offer him an answer he badly needed. "Your Grace," she said quietly, not wishing to startle him. He turned, and the armor returned to his face almost instantly, though not quite fast enough to hide what she had already seen. "Miss Whitmore, you are about early. As are you." "I sleep poorly," he admitted, and seemed almost surprised at his own honesty. He looked back toward the dry fountain. "My father meant to have this repaired for years. He never found the time, or perhaps he never found the will. There is a great deal about this estate that was left unfinished when he died." Eleanor chose her next words with great care, aware that she walked a narrow path between the silence she had promised and the concern she could no longer deny feeling. "Unfinished business can be a heavy inheritance," she said. "Heavier, perhaps, than land or title." His eyes cut to hers, sharp and searching, and for a long moment she feared she had said too much, that he would see straight through to the deed she had glimpsed and the conversation with Mr. Cole she had overheard. But whatever he saw in her face seemed to reassure him rather than alarm him, and something in his shoulders eased, just slightly. "You are an unusual governess, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Most in your position would not dare speak so plainly to their employer." "Most in my position have not been asked to smile and say nothing on their very first evening," she replied, before she could stop herself. She expected anger. Instead, to her great surprise, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that it changed his whole face. "No," he agreed quietly. "I suppose they have not." They stood together a moment longer in the cold morning air, neither speaking, and Eleanor felt something shift between them that she could not name, a thread of understanding drawn taut across the distance that rank and secrecy had built between them. It frightened her, how easily she wanted to close that distance further, how badly she wanted to tell him what she had seen and ask him, plainly, what mistake his father had made, and what it would cost them all when the truth finally came due. But she had given her word, and so she only inclined her head and continued on her walk, leaving him alone once more beside his broken fountain. Behind her, she thought she heard him exhale, long and slow, as though he too had been holding something back that he had very nearly let go. By the time she reached the schoolroom, Grace was already waiting, her small face bright with the particular energy of a child who had slept well and eaten a good breakfast, blessedly unaware of the weight pressing down on every adult in the house around her. Eleanor smiled at her, genuinely this time, grateful for the simple clarity of lessons and letters after a morning so thick with things unsaid. But even as she guided Grace through her sums, part of her mind remained in the garden, turning over the Duke's tired eyes, the crack in his composure, the strange warmth that had passed between them despite everything standing in its way. She had come to Ashcombe Hall a stranger, bound only by wages and a promise of silence. She was beginning to understand that she would not leave it as the same woman who had arrived. She was becoming part of it. Mr. Edmund Cole did not leave Ashcombe Hall after his first visit, and his continued presence settled over the household like a slow, spreading frost. He took rooms in the village inn rather than under the Duke's roof, but he called at the house nearly every day, always with some fresh excuse, always with that same unhurried smile that made Eleanor's skin prickle whenever she passed him in the hall. He asked the servants pointed questions disguised as idle curiosity, how long they had served the family, whether the old Duke had spoken often of his brother, whether anyone recalled a christening some 15 years past. Eleanor watched the staff grow more tight-lipped with each passing day, watched Mrs. Bell's hands tremble slightly as she poured the tea whenever Mr. Cole was announced. It was during one of these visits, a week after the morning in the garden, that Mr. Cole cornered Eleanor herself. She had been crossing the entrance hall with an armful of Grace's books when he stepped directly into her path, his smile widening in a way that did not reach his pale eyes. "Miss Whitmore, is it not?" he said. "The new governess. I have heard a great deal about your patience with the little one." "You are too kind, sir." Eleanor tried to step around him, but he shifted just enough to block her way without seeming to do so deliberately. "I wonder," he said, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence, "whether a woman in your position, living so closely within these walls, might have noticed anything unusual. Papers left where they should not be, conversations not meant for other ears. A governess sees a great deal that others miss, does she not? Children have no secrets from the woman who teaches them their letters, and neither, I imagine, does a household." Eleanor's heart beat hard against her ribs, but she kept her face carefully composed, drawing on every ounce of the control she had built over years of managing her own difficult circumstances. "I am afraid I notice very little beyond my lessons, sir. My days are given entirely to Miss Grace." "A pity." Mr. Cole's smile did not waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "Because I have reason to believe there are documents in this house. Documents that would interest a great many people should they ever come to light. Documents that would prove the current Duke sits upon a title that was never rightfully his father's to pass down. If you should happen upon anything of that nature, Miss Whitmore, I would make it very worth your while to bring it to my attention." "I am not for sale, Mr. Cole," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended. His smile finally slipped, just for a moment, revealing something harder and more dangerous beneath the polished manners. "Everyone is for sale, Miss Whitmore. It is only a matter of finding the right price. I do hope, for your sake and the child's, that you reconsider before this matter grows any uglier than it needs to be." He inclined his head in a mockery of a bow and continued on his way, leaving Eleanor standing frozen in the entrance hall, her arms still full of books, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had known, in some abstract way, that the secret she carried was dangerous. Standing face to face with Mr. Cole's thinly veiled threat made that danger suddenly, sharply real. She did not tell the Duke what had passed between them. She told herself it was because she had promised silence, but the truth, if she was honest with herself, ran deeper than any promise. She was afraid of what it would mean to admit, plainly, how much she already knew, afraid of how it might change whatever fragile understanding had begun to grow between herself and the man who governed this house. She sought out Mrs. Bell that same evening, unable to shake the unease Mr. Cole's words had left settled in her chest. She found the housekeeper in the small sitting room she kept off the kitchen, mending a torn hem by candlelight, and Eleanor lowered herself into the chair opposite without waiting to be invited. "Mr. Cole spoke to me today," Eleanor said quietly. "He asked me to bring him certain papers, should I ever come across them. He offered payment." Mrs. Bell's needle stilled. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the fabric in her lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "That man has been circling this house like a crow over a dying animal since the week his letter first arrived. I had hoped he would tire of it and go back to whatever hole he crawled from." "Who is he, truly?" Eleanor asked. "I have heard his name mentioned as though it carries some claim on this family, though no one will say plainly what that claim is." Mrs. Bell set down her mending entirely and studied Eleanor's face for a long moment, as though weighing how much a governess of only a few weeks' acquaintance could be trusted with. "I have served this family since before the current Duke was born," she said finally. "I buried the old Duke's wife with my own hands, helping to dress her for her rest, and I raised the current Duke and his brother both, near enough, when their own mother could not always manage it. I tell you this so you understand. I do not speak of these matters lightly." "I would never repeat anything you told me in confidence," Eleanor said. "I believe you," Mrs. Bell said, and something in her tired face softened. "Mr. Cole's mother was the old Duke's cousin, a woman named Margaret, who married beneath her station and was cast out of polite society for it. There was a will, once, an old one, drawn up before the current Duke's father inherited, that some believed favored her branch of the family over his. The will vanished after old Margaret's death, and the current title passed as it has passed for generations, father to son, with no one troubling to ask too many questions." "Until now," Eleanor said softly. "Until now," Mrs. Bell agreed. "Mr. Cole believes, or claims to believe, that the will still exists somewhere in this house, and that it names his branch of the family as the rightful heirs to everything, the land, the title, all of it. Whether he is right, I could not say. I only know the current Duke has spent every sleepless night since Cole's arrival trying to determine whether such a document exists, and if it does, what might be done before Cole finds a way to make his claim public. Eleanor sat with this new knowledge a long while after leaving Mrs. Bell's small sitting room, turning it over alongside everything she had already seen and pieced together on her own. A vanished will. A cousin cast out and never reconciled. A son now circling the estate like a hawk, hungry for what he believed had been stolen from his mother's line. It explained the deed she had glimpsed that first night, the newer document transferring claim through means she had not been able to fully read in the candlelight. It explained, too, the desperation in the Duke's eyes whenever the subject came near enough to touch. That understanding continued to grow despite everything, in small moments stolen between duties. The Duke began seeking her out in the evenings, ostensibly to discuss Grace's progress, though their conversations wandered further afield with each passing week. He asked her opinion on books he had read. He told her, once, of a childhood summer spent fishing in the estate's northern stream with his younger brother, a man Eleanor had never heard mentioned before or since, and the grief that crossed his face when he spoke of him told her more than his words ever could. "You had a brother?" she asked gently, one evening in the study. The fire burned low between them. "I did." The Duke's voice was quiet, distant, as though reaching back across a great span of years. "He died when I was 17. A fever, sudden and cruel. My father was never quite the same afterward. Some men grieve loudly, Miss Whitmore. My father grieved by making decisions he should never have made, decisions born of desperation rather than wisdom." Eleanor's breath caught. She understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that he was speaking of the deed, circling close to the truth without quite naming it, testing perhaps whether she might be trusted with more. "What sort of decisions?" she asked softly. The Duke's eyes met hers across the firelight, and for one suspended moment, she thought he might finally tell her everything. His mouth opened, the words visibly gathering behind his teeth. But then something shuddered behind his gaze, some old habit of caution reasserting itself, and he shook his head slowly. "Decisions that are not yet mine to share," he said. "Forgive me. It grows late, and Grace will want you rested for her lessons." Eleanor rose to leave, disappointment and understanding warring within her in equal measure. At the door she paused and looked back at him, silhouetted against the dying fire, and found she could not simply walk away without saying something true. "Your Grace," she said, "whatever burden you carry, you do not carry it as well hidden as you believe. Grace notices. Mrs. Bell notices. I imagine half this household notices, and says nothing, out of loyalty to you. You are not as alone in this as you seem to think." He did not answer, but he did not look away either, and something passed between them in the silence, an acknowledgement neither was yet ready to speak aloud. Eleanor left the study with her heart beating strangely, caught somewhere between fear for what was coming and a warmth she had not expected to feel for a man who had once ordered her, so coldly, to smile and say nothing. The days that followed brought no relief from the tension gathering over Ashcombe Hall. Mr. Cole's visits grew more frequent, his questions sharper, his patience visibly thinning. Mrs. Bell moved through her duties with the strained watchfulness of a woman waiting for a storm to break. Even Grace, sensitive as children often are to the moods of the adults around them, grew quieter at her lessons, her small hands trembling once over a simple sum, until Eleanor gently took them in her own, and asked what troubled her. "I heard my uncle shouting last night," Grace admitted. "At Mr. Cole. I have never heard him shout before." Eleanor drew the girl into a gentle embrace, murmuring reassurances she was not entirely certain she believed herself. "Sometimes grown men shout when they are frightened, just as you told me before. It does not mean anything terrible is happening. It only means your uncle is trying very hard to protect the things he cares for, and that includes you, Grace, more than anything else in this house." Grace nodded against her shoulder, though her small body remained tense, and Eleanor held her a moment longer, her own mind racing. She thought of Mr. Cole's veiled threat in the entrance hall, of the Duke's unfinished confession by the dying fire, of the locked drawer she had glimpsed weeks before, its contents capable of unmaking everything this family had built. The pieces were drawing closer together now, tightening around all of them like a net slowly pulled taut, and Eleanor understood, with growing certainty, that the moment of reckoning could not be far off. That evening, alone in her room, she finally allowed herself to examine the feelings she had been holding at arm's length since her first morning in the garden. She thought of the Duke's tired eyes, his rare unguarded smile, the grief he carried for a brother lost too young, and a father whose desperate mistakes now threatened to unravel everything. She thought, too, of her own growing unwillingness to remain merely a silent witness to whatever came next. She had promised to smile and say nothing, but watching Grace's small shoulders tense at the sound of raised voices, watching the Duke's careful composure crack a little further each day, Eleanor knew that promise would not hold much longer. Something was coming to Ashcombe Hall, something that would demand more of her than silence, and when it arrived she would have to choose, plainly and finally, where her loyalties truly lay. Sleep, when it finally came that night, brought no peace with it. Eleanor dreamed of locked drawers and broken seals, of Mr. Cole's cold smile stretching wider and wider, until it swallowed the whole house, and she woke before dawn with her heart pounding, and her sheets twisted around her legs. She lay still for a long while, listening to the wind outside her window, and found herself thinking not of the danger Mr. Cole represented, but of the Duke's face in the firelight, the way grief and fear had softened his usual cold composure into something achingly human. She rose before the household stirred and made her way down to the kitchen, hoping the simple business of warming a pot of tea might settle her nerves before Grace's lessons began. She did not expect to find the Duke there before her, seated alone at the servants' table in his shirt sleeves, a ledger open before him that he was clearly too exhausted to read. "You keep strange hours, Your Grace," she said, surprised into honesty by the earliness of it all. He looked up, and for once he did not trouble to arrange his features into their usual guarded calm. Dark shadows ringed his eyes, and his hair, usually so carefully combed, fell loose across his forehead. "I have not slept more than a handful of hours since Cole arrived," he admitted. "There are papers I must find before he finds them first, and I have searched every room in this house twice over without success." Eleanor's mouth went dry. She thought of the drawer she had seen that first night, its lock broken and later repaired, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she ought to tell him plainly what she had witnessed. The words gathered on her tongue, ready to spill free, but some instinct held her back, some sense that the timing was not yet right, that trust between them had not yet grown strong enough to survive so large a confession. "What sort of papers?" she asked instead, keeping her voice carefully neutral as she filled the kettle. "A will," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something to speak aloud. "One that may exist, or may not. One that could change everything about who I am, and what right I have to any of this. The house, the title, the ability to give Grace the life she deserves." He rubbed a hand over his face, weary in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep alone. "I should not be telling you this. I promised myself I would tell no one until I understood the matter fully myself." "Perhaps," Eleanor said gently, setting the kettle over the fire, "understanding comes more easily when it is not carried alone." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her breath catch in her throat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. The kitchen around them was quiet, the household still asleep, and in that fragile, unguarded hour before dawn, Eleanor felt the distance between them narrow to almost nothing. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I find myself grateful, more than I can properly express, that you came to this house when you did." Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks, and busied herself with the tea, rather than answer immediately, uncertain what her voice might reveal if she trusted it too soon. But when she finally looked up, she found him watching her still, and the look in his eyes told her, plainly enough, that whatever storm was gathering around Ashcombe Hall, she was no longer standing outside it. She had become, without quite meaning to, someone he needed as much as he needed the truth he was so desperately seeking. She only hoped, when that moment of reckoning came, she would have the courage to choose rightly, and not merely safely. The searching began in earnest the following week, though it was carried out in secret, away from the eyes of Mr. Cole and the wider household alike. The Duke enlisted only 3 people he trusted completely. Mrs. Bell, whose knowledge of the house ran deeper than anyone else living, Mr. Pratt the steward, whose quiet loyalty had never once wavered, and, to Eleanor's own surprise, herself. He came to her one evening after Grace had been put to bed and asked, with a formality that could not quite disguise how much the request cost his pride, whether she would help him search the old nursery wing, a part of the house long closed off and rarely visited. "I would not ask," he said, "if I had anyone else I trusted as completely. But you have already shown yourself capable of holding a confidence, Miss Whitmore, and I find I have grown weary of carrying this burden entirely alone." Eleanor agreed at once, though her heart raced at the thought of what searching that wing together might mean, both for the secret they hoped to uncover, and for whatever fragile understanding continued to grow between them with each passing day. The old nursery wing had not been used since the Duke and his brother were children, and dust lay thick over every surface, undisturbed for what looked like decades. Sheets covered the furniture like pale ghosts, and the air carried the particular staleness of rooms too long shut against the world. Eleanor worked alongside the Duke by lamplight, moving through drawers and cupboards, unearthing old toys and forgotten letters, and the small, sad artifacts of a childhood cut short by grief. On the first night, they worked mostly in silence, both still cautious of the intimacy the shared task demanded. Eleanor sorted through a chest of old linens while the Duke examined the contents of a writing desk pushed into the far corner, its drawers swollen shut with age and damp. He worked the wood loose with a small knife, muttering under his breath at the stubbornness of the lock, and Eleanor found herself watching his hands rather than her own task, struck by how differently he moved when no one but her was there to see him. "Nothing," he said at last, straightening with a sigh as the final drawer came free to reveal only a nest of dried moth wings and a child's broken toy soldier. "Another room. Another disappointment." "We have hardly begun," Eleanor said, more gently than she intended. "A will hidden well enough to escape notice for 15 years will not surrender itself in a single evening." He managed a tired half-smile at that, the first she had seen from him in days, and something in her chest warmed at having put it there. They continued through the room methodically, checking behind loose panels, beneath floorboards that creaked with age, inside the hollow backs of old portraits stacked against the wall. The work was slow and often fruitless, but Eleanor found she did not mind the hours passing. There was a peace in it, an honesty to searching side by side for something neither of them could yet see, that felt entirely unlike the careful, guarded exchanges that had marked their earlier weeks together. On the second night, they moved to what had once been the old Duke's private sitting room, tucked at the very end of the nursery wing, smaller than the rest and crowded with furniture that had clearly been pushed there and forgotten. It was here, among stacks of old correspondence and yellowed newspapers, that Eleanor found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, addressed in a woman's careful hand to a man she did not recognize. "These are addressed to your father," she said, examining the direction on the topmost letter, "but not written by anyone I know of in this house." The Duke crossed the room quickly and took the bundle from her hands, his expression tightening as he read the name upon them. "Margaret," he murmured, "my father's cousin, Cole's mother." He untied the ribbon with careful fingers, and together they read through letters that spoke of estrangement, of a marriage the family had never forgiven, of a woman writing again and again to a cousin who never once replied. There was pain in every line, old grief long since gone cold, but nothing that spoke directly of a will, or of any document that might settle the question of rightful inheritance once and for all. They did not find the will that first night, nor the second, but they found each other, in a manner of speaking, in the quiet hours spent sifting through the past side by side. The Duke spoke more freely in that dusty, forgotten wing than he had anywhere else in the house, telling her of games he had played there with his brother, of a mother who had died when he was too young to remember her clearly, of a father who had grown harder and more distant with every loss the family suffered. "I used to think," he admitted one night, sitting back on his heels amid a scattering of old letters, "that if I simply worked hard enough, managed the estate well enough, cared for Grace faithfully enough, none of the old mistakes would matter. I could simply outrun them." He laughed, low and without much humor. "I understand now that mistakes do not stay buried forever. They wait, and they choose their own moment to rise." "You have done nothing wrong yourself," Eleanor said firmly. "Whatever your father did, it was not your doing, and it does not make you less worthy of what you have built since." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, something raw and grateful moving behind his eyes. "You say that with such certainty." "I have watched you these past weeks," she said. "I have watched how you care for Grace, how seriously you take the burden of this estate, and everyone who depends upon it. A man who inherited dishonestly would not carry that weight so heavily, Your Grace. He would simply enjoy what he had taken and trouble himself no further." Something shifted in his expression then, a softening so complete it seemed to erase, for a moment, all the coldness she had first encountered on her arrival. Before she quite understood what was happening, he had crossed the small distance between them and taken her hand in his grip warm and slightly unsteady. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, "I do not know what I would have done these past weeks without you." She did not pull her hand away. The lamplight flickered between them, and for one suspended moment, the danger circling the house, the vanished will, the threat of Mr. Cole's ambitions, all of it fell away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet dust of a childhood long past. He leaned closer, and she found she did not want to stop him, that every instinct of caution she had carried into this house had softened into something far warmer, and far more dangerous than silence. Their lips had barely touched when a sharp knock at the nursery door broke the moment apart. Mr. Pratt stood in the doorway, breathless and pale, a folded paper clutched in his hand. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. Mr. Cole has sent word. He means to bring his claim before the magistrate at week's end, unless a settlement is reached before then." The Duke rose quickly, all the warmth of a moment before hardening back into the sharp, guarded composure Eleanor had first met on her arrival. "Show me," he said, and followed Mr. Pratt from the room without a backward glance, leaving Eleanor alone amid the dust and the scattered letters, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart torn between the danger closing in around them and the tenderness she could not, try as she might, will herself to forget. She did not see him again that night, nor for much of the following day. The household moved through its routines with an air of taut anticipation, servants exchanging worried glances in the corridors, Mrs. Bell's hands trembling more than once over her usual tasks. Grace, sensing the tension though understanding none of its cause, grew clingy and quiet, and Eleanor spent extra hours with her that day, reading aloud from her favorite stories in an effort to shield the girl from a storm neither of them could yet see the shape of. It was late that evening, well past the hour when the household usually settled, that the Duke finally sent for Eleanor again. She found him in his study, the same room where he had given her that strange, cold order on her very first night, and the sight of him standing once more by the tall window struck her with the force of how much had changed since then. "Mr. Cole has given me an ultimatum," he said without preamble. "I am to produce proof that my father's inheritance was lawful, or surrender the title and the estate entirely, before the magistrate makes it a matter of public record. He has given me until week's end." "And the will?" Eleanor asked. "Have you found any trace of it?" "None." He turned to face her, and the exhaustion in his face was matched now by something harder, more determined. "But I begin to wonder whether the will's existence matters less than what I choose to do about the truth I already know." Eleanor stepped closer, drawn by the rawness in his voice. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said slowly, as though the words were being forced out from somewhere long buried, "that I have known, for some years now, that my father's claim to the title rested on shaky ground. I found papers of my own, after his death, that suggested as much, though I could never bring myself to examine them closely enough to know for certain. I told myself ignorance was a kind of mercy. I see now it was only cowardice, dressed up to look like grief." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and unguarded, and Eleanor understood, with sudden clarity, that this was the moment he had been circling for weeks, the truth he had almost spoken by the dying fire, the truth she herself had glimpsed by candlelight on her very first night in this house. She thought of the deed she had seen, the broken lock, the newer document transferring claim through means she still did not fully understand. She thought of her promise to smile and say nothing, and knew, standing there in the firelit study, that the time for silence had very nearly run its course. He turned to face her fully, his exhaustion giving way to something more alert, more searching. "Tell me what, Eleanor?" She drew a breath, feeling the weight of weeks of silence pressing against her chest, demanding release. "On my very first night in this house, before I had even unpacked my case, I could not sleep. I went looking for a book to distract myself, and I found my way, quite by accident, into a small study I had not yet been shown. There was a drawer, forced open, its lock broken. I saw papers spilled across the desk before I could stop myself from looking." The Duke went very still. "What papers?" "A deed," she said, forcing herself to hold his gaze, though every instinct urged her to look away. "Bearing the name of this estate, and beneath it, another name I did not recognize, dated some 15 years past. And beneath that, a second document, newer, signed in your father's hand, transferring the claim." She paused, watching the color drain slowly from his face. "I did not understand what I had seen at first. I only understood, later, when you gave me your order to smile and say nothing, that you had been speaking of exactly this." For a long moment, the Duke said nothing at all. He turned away from her, toward the window, his shoulders rigid, and Eleanor's heart clenched with fear that she had finally broken whatever fragile trust had grown between them these past weeks. But when he spoke, his voice held no anger, only a kind of weary relief, as though a weight he had carried entirely alone had finally, at least in part, been set down. "I have wondered, more than once, whether you knew something," he said quietly. "There were moments these past weeks when you looked at me with such understanding, such careful patience, that I suspected you saw more than you let on. I told myself I was imagining it. I did not wish to imagine a stranger discovering, on her very first night in my home, the one truth I had spent years trying to bury. "I kept my word," Eleanor said. I smiled, and I said nothing, exactly as you asked. But I could not stop seeing it, Your Grace, or stop wondering what it meant for you, for Grace, for everyone in this house who depends on the life you have built here. He turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes held none of the coldness she had first encountered, only a raw, unguarded gratitude that took her breath away. "You have carried a great weight these past weeks, and carried it well, far better than I deserved, given how coldly I first treated you." "You were frightened," she said simply. "I understand that now, better than I did then." "Frightened," he agreed, "and proud, and unwilling to trust anyone with a secret that could unmake everything I hold dear. But I find, standing here now, that I trust you more than I have trusted anyone in a very long time." He crossed the room slowly and took her hands in both of his grip warm and steady despite everything pressing down upon them. "Whatever comes when Mr. Cole makes good on his threat, I do not wish to face it without you beside me, Eleanor. I have not wished it for some time now, if I am honest with myself." Eleanor's heart raced, torn between the danger still gathering outside these walls and the warmth of his hands around hers, the sincerity in his voice that no title or fortune could counterfeit. "Then let us face it together," she said softly, "and let us find that will, or whatever truth waits to be found, before Mr. Cole finds a way to twist it against you." He nodded, and for a moment, standing together in the firelit study where this strange and dangerous story had first begun, the threat of the coming week felt almost bearable, softened by the understanding that neither of them, any longer, stood entirely alone. With the truth finally spoken between them, the search for the missing will took on a new urgency and a new closeness that neither Eleanor nor the Duke troubled to hide, at least not from each other. They returned to the nursery wing the following night, and the night after that, working now not as employer and governess bound by careful distance, but as two people united by a common purpose. Mrs. Bell joined them on the third night, her knowledge of the house's older corners proving invaluable, and it was the housekeeper who finally suggested the one place none of them had yet thought to search. "The old chapel," she said, standing in the nursery doorway with a lamp held high. "It has not been used since the current Duke's mother passed, and your father, forgive me for saying so, was not a man given to prayer in his later years. If he wished to hide something where no one would think to look, and where it might still remain close enough to feel like a kind of penance, I cannot think of a more likely place." The chapel stood at the far edge of the estate grounds, small and ivy-covered, its door swollen shut from years of disuse. The Duke forced it open with his shoulder, and the three of them stepped inside to a space thick with dust and shadow, moonlight falling in pale bars through narrow windows onto rows of empty pews. It felt, Eleanor thought, like stepping into a held breath, a place where grief had been locked away, alongside whatever secrets it guarded. The three of them spread out to search the small space methodically, the Duke examining the old vestry cupboards while Mrs. Bell checked behind the faded tapestries lining the walls, and Eleanor moved slowly along the rows of pews, running her hands beneath each seat in case something had been tucked away out of sight. The silence of the chapel pressed close around them, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional creak of old wood settling beneath their careful hands. "Your father came here often, in his final years," Mrs. Bell said quietly, her voice carrying strangely in the empty space. "I thought it strange at the time, given how little faith he showed in the years before. I see now perhaps he was not here for prayer at all, but for something closer to confession, even if he never spoke the words aloud to another soul." "Guilt makes strange pilgrims of us all," the Duke murmured, prying open a cupboard that released a small cloud of dust and the musty smell of old hymnals long since abandoned to time. Eleanor said nothing, focused on her own careful search, but she found herself watching the Duke as he worked, struck by the tenderness with which he handled even the smallest relics of his father's private grief, a woman's embroidered kneeler, a child's prayer book with a faded ribbon marking a page long since forgotten. Whatever anger he carried toward his father's choices, it was tempered by something gentler, a son's lingering hope that the man who had failed him so completely might still, somewhere beneath all his mistakes, have been trying his best with the little courage he had left. They searched for nearly an hour before Eleanor's fingers, running along the underside of the old altar, found a seam in the wood that did not belong. A small compartment, cleverly hidden, sprang open at her touch, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, lay a single folded document, its seal unbroken, its ink still dark and legible after all these years. The Duke's hands shook as he unfolded it, and Eleanor stood close beside him, Mrs. Bell holding the lamp near enough for all three of them to read. It was the will. Old Margaret's father's will, drawn up decades before, naming his estate and title to pass, upon his death, not to the current Duke's grandfather alone, but jointly to both his children, Margaret included, with instructions that any dispute over inheritance be settled through equal division of the estate's income, rather than through the title itself, which by law of the peerage could pass only through the male line. It was, Eleanor realized as she read it more carefully, not the damning document Mr. Cole had led everyone to fear. Margaret had never been entitled to the title itself, only to a fair share of the estate's income, a share her family had been unlawfully denied for 2 generations. He hid it, the Duke said quietly, staring at the paper as though it might vanish if he looked away. My father found this, and hid it, rather than share what was rightfully owed, and let his cousin's family believe they had no claim at all, when in truth they were owed a debt he simply refused to pay. It does not mean you have no right to the title, Eleanor said gently. The title was always yours by law, but the income owed to Margaret's family, and by extension to Mr. Cole, that debt is real, and it has gone unpaid for far too long. The Duke was silent a long moment, the weight of the discovery settling over him visibly, and then he nodded, slowly, as though a decision long avoided had finally crystallized into clarity. Then it will be paid, he said. Not because Cole threatens to ruin me, but because it is owed, and because my father's cowardice has cost this family enough already. I will not add my own to the ledger. Eleanor felt a surge of pride so sudden and complete it nearly stole her breath. This was not the cold, guarded man who had greeted her on her first night at Ashcombe Hall. This was a man choosing honor over fear, even when fear might have offered the easier path. But the will alone would not be enough to settle the matter cleanly. Mr. Cole, they all understood, wanted more than a debt repaid. He wanted the destruction of the family that had cast his mother out, wanted the scandal and ruin that public exposure would bring, regardless of what fair settlement might be offered privately. The following morning, the Duke summoned Mr. Cole to the main study and asked Eleanor, to her surprise, to remain present for the conversation. I want a witness, he told her quietly, before Cole arrived. Someone who has seen the truth of this matter from its very beginning, and who I trust to help me navigate it wisely. I do not entirely trust my own judgment where this man is concerned. My temper has already gotten the better of me once in his presence. Mr. Cole arrived precisely on time, his smooth smile firmly in place, clearly expecting either capitulation or continued denial. He was visibly startled to find Eleanor present, and more startled still when the Duke laid the recovered will upon the desk between them without preamble. I have found what you came here seeking, the Duke said. Read it carefully, Mr. Cole, before you decide how you wish to proceed. Cole's composure faltered as he read, his eyes moving quickly across the old script, and Eleanor watched something complicated move across his face. Not quite triumph, not quite disappointment, but a strange mixture of both. This does not name my mother's line as rightful heirs to the title, he said finally. No, the Duke agreed. It does not, and never did. The title has always passed correctly, through the male line, as the law requires. But it does establish a debt, owed to your mother and her descendants, that my father chose to bury rather than honor. I intend to correct that failure, Mr. Cole, not because you have threatened me with scandal, but because it is the right thing to do, and long past due. And if I do not find your generosity sufficient? Cole asked, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. If I still choose to bring this matter before the magistrate, and let all of society hear how your family cheated mine for 2 generations? Then you may do so, the Duke said steadily, and you will find that I will not fight you for the sympathy of society, nor pretend my father's failures did not occur. I will simply tell the truth, all of it, and offer the settlement I have already decided to offer, regardless of your answer today. The choice before you, Mr. Cole, is not whether you receive what is owed. That has already been decided. The choice is only whether you receive it quietly, with dignity intact for both our families, or loudly, with scandal attached to a story that need not carry any. Eleanor watched Cole's face carefully as he weighed the offer, and she saw, beneath the calculation, something that looked almost like exhaustion, the tiredness of a man who had spent years nursing a grievance he had never quite known how to resolve. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier edge entirely. My mother died believing her own family had thrown her away without a second thought, he said quietly. She spoke of it until her final days, the shame of it, the injustice. I did not come here only for money, Your Grace, whatever you may believe of me. I came because I wanted someone, finally, to admit that what was done to her was wrong. It was wrong, the Duke said, without hesitation. I admit it freely, and I am sorry for it, though the apology comes 2 generations too late to reach the woman who deserved it most. I can only offer what remains within my power to give, honestly and without further delay. Something in Cole's shoulders eased, the hard armor of his earlier threats softening into something more human, more tired, more willing to be reasoned with. Then perhaps, he said slowly, we might discuss terms, Your Grace, rather than continue as adversaries. The negotiation that followed took the better part of 2 hours, and Eleanor remained throughout, offering quiet counsel when asked, watching two men who had begun as enemies find, slowly and carefully, a path toward something that resembled peace. By the time Mr. Cole finally departed Ashcombe Hall that evening, the threat of the magistrate and public scandal had been set aside entirely, replaced by a private settlement that would see a fair portion of the estate's income directed to Margaret's descendants going forward, quietly and without fanfare, exactly as the old will had always intended. When the door finally closed behind Mr. Cole's departing carriage, the Duke turned to Eleanor with an expression she had never before seen on his face, something unguarded and full of relief so complete it seemed to leave him almost unsteady on his feet. It is done, he said, or very nearly. There will be papers to draw up, lawyers to consult, but the worst of it, the threat that has hung over this house since Cole's first letter arrived, is finally settled. He looked at her then, and his voice softened further still. I could not have found the courage to face it honestly without you, Eleanor. I want you to know that plainly. You found the courage yourself, she said. I only stood beside you while you found it. That is not nothing, he said, stepping closer. That is, in fact, very nearly everything. He reached for her hand, and this time there was no interruption, no urgent knock at the door to pull them apart. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, questioning, and then, when she did not pull away, it deepened into something that spoke of weeks of careful restraint finally given permission to fall away entirely. When at last they parted, both slightly breathless, the Duke rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, unsteady breath. I do not know what happens next, he admitted quietly. I only know I do not wish to face it without you beside me, not tomorrow, and not for however many tomorrows follow after. Eleanor closed her eyes, letting herself simply feel the warmth of the moment, the danger finally receding, the future opening before them uncertain but no longer frightening. Then let us find out together, she said, one day and one truth at a time. News of the settlement spread quietly through the household over the following days, carried not through any formal announcement, but through the visible easing of tension in every corner of Ashcombe Hall. Mrs. Bell hummed softly to herself as she went about her morning tasks, a habit Eleanor had not once heard from her since her arrival. Mr. Pratt walked with a lighter step, no longer burdened by the folder of anxious papers he had carried everywhere for weeks. Even the house itself seemed different somehow, the shadows less heavy, the silence less watchful, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath alongside everyone within them and could finally exhale. Grace noticed the change most of all, though she could not have named its cause. She grew brighter at her lessons, quicker to laugh, more willing to chatter freely about her days rather than retreating into the careful, watchful quiet Eleanor had come to recognize as the girl's response to trouble she did not fully understand. One afternoon, walking together through the gardens after lessons had concluded, Grace slipped her small hand into Eleanor's without warning, and looked up at her with unusual seriousness. Uncle seems happier, she said. Ever since Mr. Cole stopped visiting so often, did something good happen? Eleanor considered how best to answer a child too young for the full weight of what had transpired, yet old enough to deserve some honest measure of the truth. Your uncle found something that had been lost for a very long time, she said carefully, and finding it helped him set right a wrong that happened long before either of us were born. Sometimes doing the right thing, even when it is difficult, makes a person lighter afterward, rather than heavier. Grace considered this with the particular gravity children often bring to ideas too large for easy understanding. I am glad he is lighter, she said finally. I like it better when he smiles at supper. Eleanor smiled at that, squeezing the girl's small hand gently. So do I, she admitted. So do I, very much. That evening, the Duke found Eleanor in the small study where their strange and difficult story had first begun, seated near the window with a book open in her lap that she had not, in truth, been reading at all. He crossed the room and settled into the chair opposite hers, his posture looser and more open than she had ever seen it, the careful armor of their first meeting replaced entirely by something warm and unguarded. The lawyers will need another fortnight to finalize the papers, he said. But Cole has agreed to everything in principle. The settlement will be modest enough not to strain the estate, and generous enough that I believe, in time, we may even manage something closer to friendship than mere obligation between our families. That would be a fitting end to it, Eleanor said. Better, certainly, than the scandal you feared when I first arrived. Better than I deserved, given how coldly I greeted you that first night, he said, a rueful smile touching his mouth. I have thought of it often these past weeks, how badly I misjudged what kind of woman I had brought into this house. I expected, I think, someone who would simply obey without question, who would take her wages and ask nothing further of me. I did not expect someone who would see straight through my carefully guarded silence and refuse to let me carry its weight entirely alone. I very nearly did obey without question, Eleanor admitted. It was curiosity, more than courage, that led me into that study on my first night. I have spent every day since wondering whether that curiosity would prove my undoing, or something far better than I dared hope. It has proven the very best thing to happen to this house in a great many years, the Duke said quietly, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to take her hand once more. And I find myself hoping, Eleanor, that it might prove the very best thing to happen to me as well, for whatever years remain ahead of us both. The fortnight the lawyers had promised stretched into nearly a month, as legal matters so often do, but the wait passed differently than any of the anxious weeks that had come before it. Ashcombe Hall settled into a rhythm Eleanor had not thought possible on her first, rain-soaked night within its walls. The Duke, whom she had begun, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to call simply Alistair, spent his mornings with the estate's accounts and his afternoons increasingly in the company of Eleanor and Grace both, joining their lessons more often than not, teaching Grace to identify birds from the schoolroom window with a patience that would have astonished the cold, guarded man who had first greeted Eleanor in this very house. Mr. Cole visited twice more during that month, though his visits bore no resemblance to the tense, threatening calls of before. He came now with papers to review and sign, and once, unexpectedly, with a small portrait of his mother as a young woman, which he offered to the Duke with an awkwardness that suggested the gesture cost him more than he wished to admit. I thought, he said, standing rather stiffly in the study doorway, that this house might wish to remember her as something other than a grievance. She was, before everything else, a member of this family, whatever anyone chose to forget in the years since. The Duke accepted the portrait with a gravity that matched the moment and had it hung, some days later, in the gallery alongside the other family portraits, a small act of restoration that meant more to everyone in the household than its size suggested. Eleanor, watching from the corridor as it was hung, felt something settle deep in her chest, a sense that the old wrongs of this house were finally, slowly being set right, one honest gesture at a time. Eleanor found herself, during those quiet weeks, growing closer not only to the Duke but to the household as a whole in ways she had not anticipated when she first arrived. Mrs. Bell took to seeking her out in the evenings, no longer merely to warn her away from matters too dangerous to touch, but simply to talk, sharing old stories of the estate's better years, of the Duke and his brother as boys running wild through these very gardens before grief had taught them both to guard themselves so carefully. Mr. Pratt, once so tightly wound with worry, began greeting her with genuine warmth each morning, and even the youngest kitchen maids, who had barely spoken 2 words to her in her first weeks, grew comfortable enough to ask her opinion on ribbons and hairstyles as though she were an older sister rather than a stranger hired from London. You have a way of making people trust you, the Duke observed one evening, watching her laugh with 2 of the maids over some small joke Eleanor did not trouble to explain to him. I confess I do not entirely understand how you managed it. This household was not an easy one to win over. Even before Cole's arrival made everyone doubly cautious of strangers. I did not try to win anyone over, Eleanor admitted. I simply tried to be honest with them, and patient, and to remember that everyone in this house was carrying some private worry of their own, even if they never spoke of it aloud. People trust honesty, in the end, far more than they trust charm. A lesson I might have learned a great deal sooner myself, he said wryly, and spared us both several weeks of unnecessary coldness on my part. She smiled and let the observation pass without argument, though privately she thought the weeks of coldness had, in their own strange way, taught her a great deal about the man beneath the armor, lessons she might not have learned so thoroughly had he simply been warm and welcoming from the very first evening. Sometimes, she had come to understand, the most important truths revealed themselves slowly, through patience and careful attention, rather than all at once. Mr. Cole's visits, once so dreaded by the entire household, became almost ordinary as the weeks passed, marked more often now by business discussed over tea than by veiled threats exchanged in guarded tones. On his final visit before the settlement papers were signed, he lingered after the formal business concluded, accepting the Duke's offer of a glass of brandy with an ease that would have seemed impossible only a month before. I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore, he said, turning to Eleanor with unexpected sincerity. I spoke to you, that first week, in a manner no gentleman ought to speak to a lady, threatening you, however subtly, to serve my own ends. I have thought of it since with no small amount of shame. You were fighting for your mother's memory, Eleanor said gently. I understood that, even then, however uncomfortable the conversation made me at the time. That is a kinder interpretation than I deserve, Cole said, but I thank you for it regardless. He turned his glass slowly in his hand, studying the amber liquid within. I confess I came to this house prepared to hate every person living within its walls. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am leaving it with something closer to respect, and perhaps, in time, something closer to friendship. Friendship would honor your mother's memory a great deal more than continued grievance ever could, the Duke said quietly. I hope, in time, you might consider Ashcombe Hall a place you are welcome to visit, not as an adversary settling old debts, but simply as family, however distant the connection. Cole's throat worked visibly at that, and he set down his glass with a hand that was not quite steady. I would like that very much, Your Grace, more than I expected to, when I first arrived here with nothing but grievance and threats to offer. It was on a bright morning near the end of that month, with the last of the legal papers finally signed and the settlement formally concluded, that the Duke asked Eleanor to walk with him in the gardens, near the old fountain where they had first spoken honestly to one another all those weeks before. She found him there waiting, dressed more formally than his usual mornings required, and something in his careful posture told her this walk carried more weight than its casual invitation suggested. I had this repaired, he said, gesturing to the fountain, which now ran clear and bright with water for the first time since her arrival, the old stone scrubbed clean, moss cleared from its carved edges. My father meant to see to it for years and never found the will. I found, this past month, that I finally understood why some tasks feel too large to face alone, and why having someone beside you can make even the most daunting repairs feel possible. It is beautiful, Eleanor said, watching the water catch the morning light. You have given this garden new life. I hope to give a great deal more new life to this house, in time, he said, turning to face her fully. Eleanor, I have thought carefully about what I wish to say to you, and I find that despite my usual caution with words, I can think of no way to say it except plainly. You arrived at Ashcombe Hall a stranger, bound to me by nothing more than wages and an order I had no right to give. You have become, in the months since, the truest friend I have known, the wisest counsel I have had, and the person whose presence makes this house feel, for the first time in my memory, like a home, rather than merely a burden to be managed. Eleanor's breath caught, her heart racing as she watched him lower himself, with a formality that felt almost out of place given everything they had already shared, onto one knee beside the newly repaired fountain. I do not ask you to smile and say nothing any longer, he said, a smile of his own breaking across his face, the first truly unguarded smile she had seen from him since that very first strange and difficult night. I ask instead that you speak freely, for the rest of your life, as my wife, as Grace's mother in every way that matters, and as the woman who taught me that honesty, however frightening, is always lighter to carry than the secrets we hide from those who love us. Eleanor Whitmore, will you marry me? Tears rose unexpectedly to Eleanor's eyes, and she found herself laughing softly through them, overwhelmed by the completeness of the moment. The distance traveled from that first cold order in the study, to this warm, sunlit garden where he knelt before her with nothing hidden between them at all. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Alistair, I will marry you. He rose and drew her into his arms, and the kiss that followed held none of the uncertainty of their first, only the settled, joyful certainty of two people who had faced danger and secrecy together, and emerged, finally, into honest daylight. When they parted, both a little breathless, she noticed a small figure watching from the garden path, Grace, who had apparently wandered out in search of them and stood now with both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes bright with delighted surprise. Are you going to be my mother now? Grace asked, running forward the moment she was noticed, her earlier restraint forgotten entirely in her excitement. Eleanor knelt to catch the girl in a warm embrace. If you will have me, she said, I would be honored beyond anything to be your mother, Grace, for as long as you will let me. Grace's answer was simply to hug her tighter, and Eleanor felt the Duke's hand settle warmly on her shoulder, as the three of them stood together beside the newly repaired fountain, a family formed not through blood alone, but through honesty hard won, and loyalty freely given. The wedding took place some months later, in the very chapel where the old will had finally been discovered, its walls cleared of dust and its pews polished until they gleamed. filled for the first time in years with the light and laughter of a household finally free of the shadows that had haunted it for so long. Mrs. Bell wept openly through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly brought prepared for exactly this purpose. Mr. Pratt stood proudly near the front, no folder of anxious papers in sight. Even Mr. Cole attended, seated near the back, his presence a quiet testament to how thoroughly old wounds had been allowed, finally, to heal. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, unusually mild for the season, and Eleanor woke in the small room that had been hers since her very first night at Ashcombe Hall, to find Mrs. Bell already waiting with a gown laid carefully across the bed, simple and elegant, chosen together over the preceding weeks, with far more joy than either of them had expected such a task to bring. "You look every inch a duchess already," Mrs. Bell said, her voice thick with an emotion she made no effort to hide, as she helped fasten the final buttons at Eleanor's back. "I have dressed a great many brides in my years at this house, Miss Whitmore, but I confess, I have never taken such pleasure in the task as I do this morning." "I could not have asked for a better guide through these strange months," Eleanor said, turning to embrace the older woman warmly. "You have been more than a housekeeper to me since my arrival. You have been a friend, and I am deeply grateful for it." Mrs. Bell dabbed hastily at her eyes and waved the sentiment away with brisk affection, though her smile remained bright as she stepped back to admire the finished result. "Enough of that now, or you will have us both in tears before the ceremony has even begun. Come, the carriage is waiting, and a certain gentleman is pacing the chapel steps as though he fears you might change your mind at the final hour." Eleanor laughed at the image and allowed herself to be guided down through the house she had come to love so completely, past the portraits in the gallery, past the study where the whole strange story had first begun, out into the bright morning air where the carriage waited to carry her the short distance to the chapel. Grace met her at the door, resplendent in a small blue gown chosen especially for the occasion, a basket of flower petals clutched in both hands and an expression of such fierce, joyful pride that Eleanor's heart nearly overflowed at the sight of her. "I have practiced all week," Grace announced solemnly. "I will not drop the basket, and I will not walk too fast, no matter how excited I am." "I have no doubt you will do beautifully," Eleanor assured her, taking the girl's free hand as they made their way toward the chapel doors together. Grace served as flower girl, scattering petals down the aisle with the fierce concentration of a child determined to perform her role perfectly, and when Eleanor finally reached the altar and took Alistair's hands in her own, she found herself thinking back to that first rain-soaked evening, the strange order he had given her, the fear and confusion that had followed her up the stairs to her small room that first night. She could never have imagined, standing there as a frightened stranger, that the secret she stumbled upon in the dark would lead her, eventually, to this moment of complete and open joy. "You once asked me to say nothing," she murmured to him quietly, as the vicar prepared to begin the ceremony, "no matter what I saw or heard in this house." "I remember," Alistair murmured back, his eyes warm with love and no small amount of wonder at how far they had traveled together. "It remains the worst order I have ever given, and the one I am most grateful you chose, in your own quiet way, never quite to obey." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound carrying warmth through the small chapel, and turned her attention forward as the ceremony began in earnest. Whatever secrets Ashcombe Hall had once guarded so fiercely, whatever fears had once kept its master silent and its household anxious, all of it belonged now to the past, settled honestly and left behind. What remained was simply a family, imperfect and hard-won, standing together in the light of a chapel, long shadowed by grief, ready at last to begin something new. Outside, the gardens bloomed fuller than they had in years, the fountain ran clear and bright, and the old house itself seemed to settle more easily upon its foundations, as though it too had been waiting, patiently, for the day its secrets would finally be laid to rest, and its rooms filled once more with laughter freely given, rather than silence carefully kept. The wedding breakfast that followed stretched long into the afternoon, tables set out beneath the old oak trees at the edge of the garden, laughter and music carrying across grounds that had known too little of either in recent years. Grace danced with anyone who would indulge her, spinning breathlessly between Mrs. Bell and Mr. Pratt, and even, once, a rather stiff but clearly delighted Mr. Cole, who lifted her carefully by the hands and turned her in careful circles while the assembled household applauded. Eleanor watched it all from beside her husband, his arms settled comfortably around her shoulders, and felt a contentment so complete it seemed to fill every corner of her, chasing away the last traces of the fear and uncertainty that had first greeted her at Ashcombe Hall's door so many months before. "Do you regret it?" Alistair asked quietly, watching the celebration with her, That first night in the study, when I gave you an order no employer had any right to give. If I had greeted you kindly instead, none of this might have happened quite as it did." Eleanor considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind as she watched Grace's delighted spinning and Mrs. Bell's beaming face and the whole bright-heeled household gathered together beneath the old trees. "I do not regret a single moment of it," she said finally. "Not the fear, not the secrets, not even the coldness you showed me that first night. Every part of it led us here, to this exact moment, and I would not trade this moment for an easier beginning, however difficult the path to reach it." He drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair, and together they watched the celebration continue into the golden light of late afternoon. A family made whole not by the absence of hardship, but by the courage to face it honestly, together, until every shadow that had once haunted Ashcombe Hall had finally, completely, given way to light. A year had passed since the wedding beneath the old oak trees, and Ashcombe Hall in early autumn looked nothing like the shadowed, watchful house Eleanor had first entered on a rain-soaked evening, with nothing but a travel case and a promise she had not fully understood. The fountain in the garden ran clear through every season now, tended carefully by a gardener the Duke had hired specifically to see that no part of the grounds fell again into the neglect that had once marked so much of the estate. The old chapel, where the will had been found and the wedding vows exchanged, had become a place the family visited often, not from obligation but from genuine fondness, Grace especially, who liked to sit in the front pew and imagine, she said, all the secrets the old walls must still be keeping quietly to themselves. Eleanor found herself, on a crisp morning in early October, standing once more beside that same restored fountain, her hand resting lightly on the gentle curve of her own growing stomach, watching Grace chase fallen leaves across the lawn with a laughter so unrestrained it seemed to fill the whole garden with warmth, despite the cooling air. Alistair came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pressing a kiss to her temple. "She grows more like you every day," he said, watching his ward, soon to be joined by a sibling neither of them had quite expected so soon after the wedding, though both had welcomed the news with equal joy. "She grows more like herself," Eleanor corrected gently, "which is, I think, the finest thing any child can become. We have only helped her find the courage to be it fully." Much had changed in the household over the preceding year, though the changes had come gradually, in the small accumulating ways that true healing often does, rather than through any single dramatic transformation. Mrs. Bell, though still devoted entirely to the running of the house, had taken to spending her afternoons teaching Grace to bake, the kitchen filled now with flour-dusted laughter that would have been unthinkable in the tense, watchful months before Eleanor's arrival. Mr. Pratt had been promoted to full steward of the estate's expanding affairs, a position he undertook with quiet, steady competence, no longer burdened by the anxious secrecy that had once weighed so heavily on every task he touched. Mr. Cole had become, against all early expectation, a regular and welcome guest at Ashcombe Hall. He arrived every few months from his own modest estate, purchased with his portion of the settlement and managed, by all accounts, with a diligence that suggested a man finally at peace with his place in the world. He brought with him, on his most recent visit, a portrait of his own now, a young son born earlier that spring, and the sight of Alistair and Cole standing together over the small painting, comparing notes on fatherhood with an ease that would have seemed impossible a year before, struck Eleanor as one of the quiet miracles this whole strange story had ultimately produced. "I never imagined," Cole admitted to her once, during that same visit, watching Grace and his own young nephew, for so he had taken to calling the connection, playing together near the garden's edge, that the family which caused my mother such grief would become the family I now count among my dearest friends. Grief has a way of narrowing a man's whole world down to a single grievance, Miss Whitmore. It took a great deal of honesty, on all our parts, to widen it again. It took courage, Eleanor said, which is honesty's braver cousin. You showed a great deal of it yourself, in the end, choosing peace over the scandal you might so easily have pursued instead." He inclined his head at that, accepting the compliment with the same quiet grace that had marked his transformation from adversary to friend, and the two of them stood together a while longer in comfortable silence, watching the children play beneath the golden autumn light. Later that afternoon, before the light fully faded, Eleanor walked alone through the gallery where the family portraits hung in careful rows, pausing as she often did before the small painting of Margaret that Cole had gifted the household nearly a year before. The young woman's painted eyes seemed gentler now than Eleanor remembered from her first viewing, though she supposed the painting itself had not changed at all. It was her own understanding that had shifted, deepened by everything she had since learned of the grief and injustice that had shaped this family long before her own arrival. "You would be glad, I think, to see how it ended," Eleanor murmured to the portrait, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking aloud to painted canvas. "Your son found his way home again, in his own fashion, and brought his own child into a family finally willing to claim him properly." She continued down the gallery, past portraits of dukes long dead, stern-faced men whose secrets, whatever they might have been, had long since faded into the quiet irrelevance of history. She thought of how frightened she had once been of this house, of its locked rooms and its watchful silences, and marveled at how completely that fear had transformed, over the course of a single remarkable year, into something closer to deep and abiding love. Grace found her there, still lingering before the gallery's newest addition, and slipped her hand once more into Eleanor's with the easy affection that had grown between them since that very first cautious conversation in the schoolroom. "Will you tell me the whole story someday?" Grace asked, tilting her head to study Margaret's portrait alongside her. "Uncle only ever tells me pieces of it, about the will, and Mr. Cole, and the night you found the deed." Eleanor knelt beside her, considering the question with the same care she had given every honest conversation with this remarkable child since her arrival. "When you are a little older," she promised, "I will tell you every piece of it, exactly as it happened, the frightening parts as well as the joyful ones. You deserve to know the whole truth of your own family's history, not merely the comfortable pieces grown-ups sometimes prefer to share." "I would like that," Grace said solemnly, then brightened suddenly, childhood's endless resilience reasserting itself. "Will there be a happy ending?" Eleanor laughed and drew the girl into a warm embrace. "There already has been," she said. "We are living in it now." That evening, after Grace had been put to bed with the particular happy exhaustion of a child who had spent an entire day running through fallen leaves, Eleanor sat with Alistair in the small study where their strange story had first begun, the same room where he had once ordered her, so coldly, to smile and say nothing. The fire burned warm between them now, no secrets hidden in its light, no locked drawers waiting to be discovered by candlelight. "I have been thinking," Alistair said, setting aside the letter he had been reading, "of writing down the full account of what happened here. The will, Cole's mother, everything that nearly tore this family apart before it brought us together instead. Not for scandal, but for Grace, and for whatever children follow her, so that none of them ever feel compelled to guard a secret as heavily as my father guarded his, or as I once asked you to guard mine." "I think that is a fine idea," Eleanor said. "Secrets kept out of shame only grow heavier with time. Better, I think, for the next generation to inherit the truth plainly and decide for themselves what to make of it, than to stumble upon it by candlelight as I once did." He smiled at that, reaching across the small distance between their chairs to take her hand, exactly as he had done so many months before in this very room. "You changed everything about this house, Eleanor, from the very first night you refused to simply obey an order that asked far too much of a stranger's silence. I do not think I properly understood, that first evening, what a gift your curiosity would prove to be." "Nor did I," Eleanor admitted, laughing softly at the memory of her own fear and confusion on that first rain-soaked night. "I only knew I could not unsee what I had seen, and that whatever came of it, I would rather face it honestly than pretend, for the sake of comfort, that nothing at all was wrong." Outside, the autumn wind moved gently through the restored gardens, carrying the last of the season's fallen leaves across grounds that had, in the space of a single remarkable year, transformed from a place of guarded silence into a home filled with laughter, honesty, and the quiet, hard-won peace that only comes from facing the truth together, rather than hiding from it alone. Ashcombe Hall, once a house of locked drawers and careful whispers, had become, at last, simply and completely, a home. Its every room now filled with the kind of light that no secret, however old or however heavy, could ever again extinguish. And somewhere beneath the old chapel floor, in the small hidden compartment where the will had once waited 15 long years to be found, a fresh piece of paper now rested in its place, sealed carefully in the same protective oilcloth. A simple letter Alistair had written and hidden there himself, addressed to whichever future generation might one day open that same compartment in search of the past. It held no secret grievance, no hidden claim, no decades of silent shame. It held only the plain and simple truth of everything that had happened, written honestly, for anyone who might one day need the courage to face their own difficult inheritance, with the same open heart that had, in the end, saved this family from the shadows that had once threatened to consume it entirely.